Hello. I guess as you're watching this, you may well have had a similar experience to me. My experience started several months ago. I had angina for several months and it's a man thing. I ignored it and hoped it would go away. And then one evening it didn't. The pain carried on, the breathlessness carried on, and it was obvious to me that it wasn't going to stop. So at that point my wife rushed me into A&E. I underwent probably the same sorts of tests that you've undergone or you're about to have. I had an ECG, blood tests, chest x-ray, all those sorts of things. And there was an awful lot of waiting around. It seemed that I went for one test, then came back and sat and waited. Went for another test, back and waited. After quite a long time, the doctor finally diagnosed that I had a minor heart attack. And it was likely, probably, that I would have to have a stent to open up a blocked artery. And unfortunately, there were no cardiac beds available, so we couldn't do anything yet. Oh, I thought. So I was sent to A&E for sort of holding purposes, if you like. They monitored me overnight. And I have to say, I was scared. There was no two ways about it. When you have something like that, you just don't know what's going to happen. My parents had both had heart problems, so it was, I suppose in one way it was inevitable that I was going to have some kind of heart trouble. In fact, back in 1980, my dad had had an angiogram, one of the first ones when they were first introduced then. Unfortunately, they weren't stenting in those days, so sadly, he didn't last very much longer after that. So you can understand that those sorts of emotions were milling around inside of me. The nurses in A&E were great. They looked after me wonderfully. And although I still had these sort of sweeps of pain and breathlessness over me all night, they monitored me. I was being ECG'd quite often. Had various other tests done to me, it seemed every half hour or so, so I didn't sleep a wink that night. But the one comfort, I suppose, behind all that was the fact that I was in A&E, and had anything else happened to me, at least I was in the right place and they'd look after me, which was a wonderful thing. And it was the next day that things started to happen. First of all, I had a visit from a doctor from the cardiac ward, and she explained to me that they had been short of beds, but she said the very next one I'm going to allocate to you. So that was sort of comforting in itself. A bit later on, had another doctor came and saw me, and he explained what a heart attack was, what had happened inside me. He then told me the various tests that he would run through. So it was an echocardiogram, an angiogram. He explained about how a stent works. He also explained that I would be on several drugs now for the rest of my life. And all of that was actually quite a lot to take in one go. I felt comforted in one way, that he sounded as though he knew what he was talking about. But in another way, all these things were going to happen to me. But it wasn't long after that I was taken upstairs to another ward to be waiting for a bit longer. And that was when I met my first cardiac rehab nurse. Fran came to see me, and that in itself was a real comfort, because first of all, she was telling me that the various procedures that I had to have had all been booked. She had my notes and there it was all written in that I was going to have these things. So that was a positive thing. Things were moving. The second thing is she was talking about what would happen after those, when I got home and in the future. And that in itself meant that she was talking about my future. It wasn't all going to end here. There was something up after this. I was going to recover and there were things ahead of me. And that, as I say, was a real comfort. So a little bit later on, I was taken down for an echocardiogram. That was uncomfortable, but not painful, just awkward with a nurse leaning over me and swilling this thing around my chest. And that was to test the efficiency of my heart after the heart attack. Got back to the ward, and it seemed like no time at all. 2 more nurses from the catheter lab, the cath lab, came to take me there to have my angio. They were super. They were, I would call, salt of the earth type people. They were very practical, had that lovely black humour that you get in hospitals, which I appreciated immensely. They also explained to me quite a lot of how the procedure would work. And I'm one of those people who is interested in technical stuff and just want to learn how things work. So to me, that was really interesting. They prepared me. And again, it was very positive and reassuring, because they were saying, you know, this team who are going to work on you do it every day, and they are very good at what they do. So when it came to the actual angio, I just lay back on this incredibly narrow little bed that you've got to be careful don't fall off, and just let it all happen. And it was fascinating hearing them talk about what was going on, the wires going in and the balloons and this, that and the other. And it was great to look at the screen where I could see all my arteries around the heart and one really, really, really tiny one, which obviously was causing the problem. And what was brilliant was that at the end of it, I looked on the screen and saw what had been a very tiny, narrow artery was now like a great big fat slug. At the time, it was a little bit tricky, because the doctor was saying he was sort of 50-50 as to whether he was going to be able to stent me or whether I would have to go to Bristol for a bypass, because the blockage was quite close to the junction of 2 arteries. So he sort of threw it on me and said, well, you know, what do you want to do? And I thought, I'm in no position to make this decision. I said to him, well, look, you're the expert. You do this every day. You know what you're doing. I trust your judgment. You do whatever you need to do. So he thought about it momentarily and said, well, we're in there now. I think I can probably do this. And so he did. And another really encouraging thing was, after he put this thing in, there were various other doctors in a side ward somewhere, obviously looking at their screen. And once he'd done it, they all broke into applause and cheered. And I thought, oh, he's obviously got it right then. So up to this point, I'd been really calm and relaxed, and I thought I'd got it all under control. It was when they took me to the recovery area of the cardiac ward that I realised I'd actually had a huge amount of pent-up tension and emotion. One of the nurses who had taken me to the cath lab just popped her head round the corner before she was going to go off duty and said, how are you doing? And it was at that point that I burst into tears and I wailed like a baby. And it was obviously just all the emotion just gushing out of me. The realisation, I suppose, of what might have happened had this all gone wrong. Also, the just sort of taking on board all that they'd done to me. The technical aspects of poking wires up inside into arteries is just, it's stunning. And I guess that all had to come out. And that's what she said, you know, just let it go, let it out. And bless her, she stayed way beyond the time of the end of her shift until I'd sort of calmed down a bit. And she was just lovely, and I'm eternally grateful to her for that. So, paradoxically, I spent the night on the cardiac day ward. And that was interesting in itself, because there were probably about 4 or 5 other guys there who had all had, most of them had had stents the same as I. Another chap had some other monitor on, and it was interesting just to chat to them and again get sort of experiences, shared experiences, and that was nice. But again, I was still pretty wound up, I think, and that night I couldn't sleep at all. I got up, night nurse made me a cup of tea, which was lovely. And I'd brought a little book in with me with some pencils, just because I do sketching and drawing. And I spent the night writing. I just wrote and wrote and wrote, just to get those experiences out on paper, I guess. And it was a way of sort of being cathartic, I suppose. So by this time I'd been awake for 2 whole days and 2 whole nights. I was pretty tired. So the next day, things started to happen again. I prepared to go home. And I had a visit from a second cardiac rehab nurse. Jackie came to see me, and again she gave me information. She was telling me about the medications that I would have to have. She also talked about the titration service, which is where a couple of the drugs have to have their dosage increased up to a maximum level or to a level that my body can accept. And that would happen over the course of several weeks, and she would phone me each week and increase the dose and see how I was and blah, blah, blah. So she also talked to me about the cardiac rehab exercise classes, and she gave me some advice about what sort of things to do when I get home, what sort of activities to engage in. Basically, it's light duties, and start slowly and work up gradually, and not to tire yourself out. Again, information overload. Don't really take it all in. But it was all good stuff, and again, positive from the point of view that she was talking about what happens later on. Later on that day I went home and I was tired, very tired, as you can imagine. But I knew I had to get active over the next few weeks. I couldn't wrap myself in cotton wool. Although I'd had this heart attack, I've been treated, and as my wife put it, I've been mended. So get on and do things. I've got plenty to do. So I wanted to get back to doing all those various things as soon as possible. However, I did need to pace myself, and it was really good advice to just do a few things to start with. I mean, even things like making a cup of coffee and taking it back into the living room, sit in the armchair, that was enough to start with. And then gradually increase that activity. And the key thing was to stop doing those things before you get too tired. It was really interesting. My daughter lives in Vancouver, and a couple of weeks after coming out of hospital, she came over to visit for 3 weeks. Now, she had had open heart surgery a few years ago, and she went through this recovery process, probably in a bigger way than I did. But it was interesting listening to her talking to me, saying that she recognised the signs of the progress of my recovery. And she helped me a huge amount, actually, in coping with all that. There were times when I was still emotional at home. I got tearful at times. I think possibly it's difficult to remember all those different emotions, but I think I was angry at times as well, that I'd been slowed down and this had happened to me. I also felt at times worried and scared as to would this all happen again. But all the time it was that thought that yes, I've been mended and I can get on and do things again. So I followed the advice that I'd been given by the rehab team about walking. My first walk, we live 2 doors away from a park. My first walk took me from the front door to the start of the park and back again. And that's as far as I went. And again, I suppose I was worried about what would happen. I was also concerned about meeting people. To start with, I didn't want to see anybody, and I didn't want to stop and talk to them. That gradually resolved itself. But second day, we walked into the park and halfway down the path. Third day, we walked almost all the way around. And after a little while, I was doing a full circuit of the park. And after a few weeks, I was up to my 20-30 minutes walking a day and going a bit faster. And I even got to the point where if it was downhill, I started jogging. I'm not sure if I was supposed to do that, but it was easier jogging downhill than it was walking fast downhill. So things were looking up. And the next thing that came along was the cardiac rehab exercise classes. So I had to go to Bridgewater for those, and they were the first ones starting up after COVID. So I was quite fortunate that I actually had the chance to do those. When I first went for my assessment, my first thought was, this is far too easy for me. Halfway through the assessment, I thought, this is far too difficult for me because I'd realised how much fitness I'd lost and how much all this had affected me. But the good thing about the rehab classes is that they're structured, they're staged, the progression is paced, And by the end of the 6 weeks, I could see the improvement I'd made from that first assessment through to the last one. The nurses there were great. They were helpful, encouraging, instructive, and the classes were fun. And again, it was that sort of situation where I can't remember, there's probably about another 8 or 9 people in the class with me. All had the same sorts of things. Most of them had stents. One guy had had a bypass. So we had a shared experience. And part of the rehab, I think, was talking to those people as well as just doing the exercising and learning the exercises. So I would say if you get offered the exercise classes, grab the opportunity with both hands, because it really does help. And it put my mental state, if you like, on a heading towards continuing with activity and exercise, which has made me get better quicker. So after a couple of months, I was back playing golf twice a week. I'm a regular golfer, and I've got some very sympathetic friends, some of whom have stents themselves, so I know they work. And they were happy for me to play just a few holes to start with, and then they didn't mind if I went in early. But as I say, it didn't take long for me to be playing a full 18 holes, and I was back to twice a week, which was good. I did the Fast 800 diet for a few months and lost 1.5 stone. That has various benefits. It means that I now have more trousers in my wardrobe into which I can fit. And although I have put on a few of those pounds back on again, I'm much lighter than I was before and fitter than I was before. I drink less alcohol than I used to. Not that I drank like a fish before, but I eat far more vegetables and fruit than I ever used to. Not so many sweets and cakes and biscuits and things like that. But having said that, I don't deny myself completely. I've made those changes, but I don't feel that it's an oppressive change. I had set myself the task when I was at the exercise classes of running the Bristol 10K, which would have been about 8.5 months after my heart event. My daughter, I mentioned, had open heart surgery. 15 months after she'd had that, she ran the London Marathon. So I thought, well, if she can do it. Sadly, I didn't get to run that because during the summer we had this incredibly hot weather that just completely devastated my training regime. There was no way I was going to go training in temperatures of 40, 41 degrees. So not done the Bristol run. I've still got in my mind maybe next year, and I'll get back into running again. I do walk almost everywhere these days. I've always been fit and active. I've always played lots of sport. But these days, rather than take a car, I'll walk if it's local enough for me to walk. So I walk to church on Sundays. I'm in a play. I walk to 2 rehearsals a week as well. I walk to 2 art classes every week. I walk to 2 choir rehearsals every week, all in and about town. And each of them takes about 20 minutes, quarter of an hour, 20 minutes to walk to, and then back again afterwards. And that's pretty good exercise. And on the days when I'm not doing those, which isn't actually many, I sometimes walk just for the enjoyment. So I am busier than I was before my heart attack, I think. My heart's been mended. I take my medications. I've followed the advice that the cardiac rehab people have told me. I've tried to be positive and look to the future, really. I've been given a second chance is the way I look at it. Like I said, my heart's been mended and I can do more things probably than I could before. So my advice to you would be to do all those things. Do what you're told, take your medicines, follow the advice, and grab life by the scruff of the neck. Take it in both hands and enjoy the second chance that you've been given.